What if one single year could tear down dynasties, turn the tide of wars, and leave a comet blazing in the night sky? In the last chapter of Echoes of Time, we trace the threads of earlier upheavals that set the world trembling on the edge of collapse. Now we step into 1644, a year when history moved with terrible speed. In Beijing, the last Ming emperor walked alone through deserted palace halls before ending his own life as rebels swarmed the city walls. On the plains of northern England, Oliver Cromwell led his cavalry in a charge that shattered the king's army and changed the course of a nation. In the forests of Central Europe, French and Bavarian soldiers fought for 3 days in one of the bloodiest clashes of the 30 Years' War. But this was not only a year of men and battles. Northern China was gripped by famine, families selling children for a handful of millet. Overhead, a comet burned for weeks, its fiery tail stretching across the heavens, whispered about in palaces and peasant villages alike. To some, it was an omen of divine anger. To others, a sign that the world itself was shifting. Stay with us as we uncover the collapse of dynasties, the charge of armies, and the omens in the sky. Like this story, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and if you believe history should keep breathing, consider a small donation. On a cold April morning in 1644, the Chongzhen Emperor of China climbed a lonely hill behind the Forbidden City. He wore no crown, no armor, only the thin robe of a man who had lost everything. Below him, Beijing burned. His generals had fled or betrayed him. His soldiers had deserted, and the gates of the capital had been thrown open to a rebel army. Chongzhen had once been described as intelligent, diligent, and austere. He rose before dawn, inspected reports with his own hand, and tried to cut away corruption that had festered for decades. Yet he inherited an empire that was already cracking. Famines had starved the northern provinces. Locust swarms had devoured crops, and silver imports that once fueled the Ming economy had collapsed. All around him, whispers grew that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. On the 25th of April, rebel leader Li Zicheng entered Beijing with thousands of hungry peasants turned soldiers. The Forbidden City shook with the sounds of slaughter. According to chronicles, the emperor gathered what remained of his household. He ordered his daughters to take their own lives to avoid capture. His young concubines wept, refusing to leave his side. In desperation, he drew his sword and cut down one daughter himself before servants pulled him away. As the rebels stormed closer, Chongzhen fled to Coal Hill, overlooking the palace. He carried a single eunuch companion. There, beneath a twisted tree, he tried to compose his final words. With no paper at hand, he wrote with a brush on the sleeve of his robe, "I have offended heaven. I am ashamed to face my ancestors. I leave my body to the rebels. Let them not harm my people." Moments later, he hanged himself from the tree. His body was discovered the next morning by rebel troops. They mocked the fallen son of heaven. But even Li Zicheng is said to have felt uneasy at the sight. The empire of the Ming, which had stood for nearly 3 centuries, ended in silence on that hill. Legends spread quickly. Some said the emperor's ghost wandered the palace gardens, wailing for his lost kingdom. Others claimed he had not died at all, but fled south to raise another army. A few whispered that heaven itself had sent the comet, blazing that same month across the sky to mark the end of the dynasty. For the people of Beijing, there was no poetry in the fall. The rebels looted the city, taking grain, jewels, and lives. The capital that had once been the beating heart of the Middle Kingdom became a place of ashes, yet the story did not end there. Only weeks later, another force appeared on the horizon, the Manchu armies waiting at the Great Wall, ready to claim the mandate of heaven for themselves. The suicide of Chongzhen was not only the collapse of a ruler, but the unraveling of a world order. For centuries, the Ming dynasty had projected power from Beijing to the South China Sea, from Korea to Central Asia. Now that center was gone, and in the vacuum, new powers would rise. Or would be remembered in China not simply as a year of loss, but as the year the very fabric of dynasty, loyalty, and heaven's favor was torn apart. While Beijing smoldered in the hands of rebels far to the east, another drama unfolded at the narrow corridor where the Great Wall met the sea. It was here, at Shanhai Pass, that a single decision by one man would determine the fate of China. For centuries, that man was Wu Sangui. Born into a military family, Wu was trained from youth in the arts of war. He was only in his 30s in 1644, commanding one of the most powerful armies of the Ming, stationed at the eastern gate of the empire. His duty was to guard the frontier against the Manchu tribes who had long harassed Ming borders. Yet when news arrived that Beijing had fallen and the emperor had hanged himself, Wu found himself caught between two enemies. Inside the capital, Li Zicheng now declared himself the ruler of a new Shun dynasty. He sent envoys to Wu, demanding submission. Outside the Great Wall, the Manchu prince Regent Dogon waited with his banners, promising revenge against the rebels and reward for Wu's loyalty. Both sides wanted him. Both sides threatened him. Wu's hesitation is remembered in Chinese folklore as the hesitation of a man torn between loyalty and survival. His personal life added fire to the dilemma. Li Zicheng's troops had captured his concubine, Chen Yuanyuan, a famed beauty of the age. Some stories claim that Li himself took her into his palace, humiliating Wu and striking at his pride. Whether true or not, the tale spread like wildfire, painting Wu's choice not only as political, but as deeply personal. On May 25, 1644, Wu Sangui made his decision. He threw open the gates of Shanhai Pass to the Manchu armies. Together, his Ming troops and Dogon's banners marched west to confront Li Zicheng. 2 days later, at the Battle of Shanhai Pass, Li's rebel army was crushed. The Shun dynasty, barely born, was already broken. By June, the Manchus entered Beijing. Dogon installed the 6-year-old Shunji emperor on the throne, proclaiming the mandate of heaven now rested with the Qing. Wu Sangui, once a loyal Ming general, became remembered as the man who let the Manchu in. In Chinese memory, his name is forever cursed as a traitor, yet the truth is more complex. Wu likely believed that the Ming was already beyond saving. The emperor was dead, the capital burned, and the empire fractured. Faced with rebels he despised, and Manchu allies he thought he could control, he gambled on survival. History judged him harshly, but his decision reshaped the destiny of China. The Qing dynasty, established through that act of treachery, would endure for nearly 3 centuries, until the revolution of 1911. Even in later years, poets and playwrights returned to Wu's betrayal. Some saw him as a villain, consumed by lust and ambition. Others painted him as a tragic figure, trapped in an impossible choice, punished by fate no matter which side he chose. The story of Chen Yuanyuan became embroidered with legend, turning her into the beauty who toppled a dynasty. In the end, Shanhai Pass was more than a fortress. It became the hinge of history. One gate opened, and an entire empire passed from one dynasty to another. While armies clashed and dynasties fell, a quieter and more merciless enemy stalked the people of northern China. Famine does not roar like cannons or blaze like a comet. It creeps into villages on empty stomachs. It turns neighbors into beggars. It drives fathers to sell their children and mothers to boil grass for soup. In 1644, famine was the shadow behind every rebellion. The North China Plain, once the heartland of Ming agriculture, had endured years of failed harvests. Drought hardened the soil into dust, Then swarms of locusts swept through the fields, leaving nothing but barren stalks. Officials reported that in Henan province alone, thousands starved to death each month. Grain prices doubled, then tripled. In some towns, a handful of millet cost more than a silver tael, far beyond what a common farmer could pay. As Beijing teetered, refugees poured into the city. Chroniclers describe endless lines of hollow-eyed peasants dragging their children. Behind them, hoping the capital's granaries would offer relief. Instead, they found walls closed and guards ready to strike down anyone who begged too loudly. The capital became a cauldron of despair. Some records speak of cannibalism in the countryside. Villagers so desperate that they killed the weak to feed the strong. Whether every tale is true or not, the rumors themselves were enough to ignite fear and rage. To the hungry, the Ming court seemed indifferent, clinging to rituals and palace quarrels, while common people wasted away. It is no coincidence that Li Zicheng's rebel army swelled with starving peasants. His promise was simple: food, land, and the end of corrupt officials who lined their own pockets while villages burned. Many who joined him did so not out of ideology, but because they had no other way to survive. Hunger is the greatest recruiter of rebellion. In the Confucian order, emperors held power only so long as they kept the people fed. When famine spread unchecked, whispers spread faster. The mandate of heaven had been lost. Even scholars and officials began to murmur that the dynasty's end was not only inevitable, but just. Imagine the fear of the Chongzhen emperor as he looked out from the palace walls and saw not only Li Zicheng's troops, but endless waves of peasants with nothing left to lose. Imagine the shame of the court officials forced to admit they had no grain to distribute, no silver to buy relief. The famine of 1644 was not a single disaster. It was years of hunger, magnified by war, corruption, and the collapse of trade. And it turned a fragile dynasty into a brittle one, ready to snap at the slightest blow. For those who lived it, famine was not an abstract cause of rebellion. It was the gnawing emptiness that drove fathers to hand their sons to strangers for a bowl of rice. It was the silence of fields where no birds sang because the locusts had eaten them too. It was the endless toll of bells, not for weddings or celebrations, but for the dead. As famine consumed the land and rebels stormed the capital, eyes across Eurasia turned upward. In March of 1644, a comet appeared in the heavens, its tail stretching across the night like a fiery broom sweeping the stars. In China, astronomers at the Imperial Observatory recorded it carefully, noting its arrival near the constellation Pegasus. To the common people, it was the Hui Xing, the broom star, said to sweep away dynasties. Officials whispered the old proverb, "When a broom star appears, kings fall and blood runs." For a dynasty already trembling, the omen struck like a thunderclap. Meanwhile, in Europe, the comet was also seen. Jesuit astronomers in Rome described its brightness, visible even at twilight. In Germany, pamphlets spread that it was a sign of God's wrath, a warning that the 30 Years' War had angered heaven beyond forgiveness. Farmers gathered in fields at night, pointing and whispering about what doom might come next. Not everyone agreed on its meaning. In some villages, the comet was celebrated as a cleansing fire, a chance for renewal. In others, it was feared as the herald of plague. The ambiguity gave it power. Each person saw in its blazing tail the reflection of their own fears. In Beijing, as the emperor prepared for his final hours, it is said he looked upon the comet and despaired. One chronicler claimed he cried out that heaven itself had abandoned him. Whether the story is true or not, it captures how natural events and human tragedy intertwined in 1644. The comet lingered for weeks, then faded into the darkness, but its memory stayed. Historians would later catalogue it as C-1644-E2, another body of ice and rock passing silently through space. Yet for those who lived under its glow, it was not cold science. It was a sign, burning in the heavens, that the world itself was shifting. From the skies over China to the war-ravaged fields of Europe, people looked up and wondered if they were witnessing the end of their age. On the evening of July 2nd, 1644, thunder clouds rolled over the fields outside the city of York. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and damp earth. Across the moor, two armies faced each other in the gathering storm. On one side, the Royalists, loyal to King Charles I, commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine. On the other, the combined forces of Parliament and their Scottish allies. It was here, on this flat expanse of farmland, that the English Civil War would be reshaped. The Royalists had marched north to relieve York, besieged for weeks. Prince Rupert, bold and feared, had already earned a reputation for reckless cavalry charges. His men believed him blessed by fortune. The parliamentarian side, however, carried a new weapon of their own, Oliver Cromwell's cavalry, the disciplined Ironsides. Unlike Rupert's men, who often pursued plunder after breaking the enemy line, Cromwell had drilled his troopers in restraint, discipline, and unity. As evening fell, the parliamentarian army seemed hesitant. Then, with sudden force, Cromwell led his cavalry into the storm. Eyewitnesses recall the roar of hooves, the crash of steel, and the cries of men as Rupert's famed horsemen reeled under the impact. "We never charged, but we routed the enemy," Cromwell later wrote. "God made them as stubble to our swords." His words echoed with conviction, but they also captured the ferocity of the fight. The battle raged for hours. Rain began to lash the field, muskets misfired in the wet, and hand-to-hand combat grew desperate. The Scots pressed from one side, Parliament from another. Finally, Rupert's army broke. Over 4,000 Royalists lay dead, their hopes for holding the north shattered. York itself, once the great bastion of the king's cause, surrendered soon after. For Cromwell, Marston Moor was more than a victory. It was proof that his model of discipline, faith and order could triumph over aristocratic daring. The Ironsides became the backbone of a new kind of army, one that would eventually defeat the king himself. For the people of England, the battle was both terrifying and transformative. Letters from survivors speak of fields strewn with corpses, of wounded men groaning in the mud, of villagers forced to bury the dead for days after. Yet in London, Parliament celebrated with fireworks, declaring that God had favoured their cause. Marston Moor revealed the fracture of a kingdom. It showed that the war was not a brief quarrel between king and Parliament, but a grinding struggle that would decide the very shape of governance in England. Would the monarchy remain supreme, or would Parliament claim sovereignty? On that stormy night in Yorkshire, the scales tipped toward revolution. The charge of Cromwell's cavalry still stands as one of the defining images of the Civil War. A farmer's son turned commander, leading men not of noble birth, but of stern resolve against the glittering cavaliers of a king. It was more than a clash of armies. It was the collision of two worlds, one fading, the other rising. In the heart of the Black Forest, beneath the shadow of medieval walls and cathedral spires, the city of Freiburg became the stage for one of the bloodiest clashes of the 30 Years' War. It was August 1644, and after decades of conflict, Europe had grown numb to battles. Yet what happened here shocked even hardened soldiers. On one side stood the French, commanded by two rising stars. The young Duke of Enghien, later known as Condé, and Marshal Turenne, a man of steady brilliance. On the other, the Bavarian army under the experienced Count Mercy, loyal to the Catholic cause and to the Habsburg Emperor. The French wanted to break into southern Germany to open a road that would threaten Bavaria and Austria. Freiburg stood in their path. For 3 days, August 3rd to 5, the hills outside the city shook with cannon fire and musket volleys. The French hurled wave after wave of assaults against Mercy's entrenched positions. The Bavarians dug into forested slopes, fought like wolves defending their den. Eyewitnesses described scenes of horror. Men clawing at earthworks with bare hands, pikes thrusting in the smoke, bodies piling in the trenches. One officer wrote that the screams of the wounded echoed so loudly that even the victorious could not sleep at night. The French finally gained ground, but at a terrible cost. Estimates suggest they lost close to 10,000 men, while the Bavarians suffered around 6,000. The chronicler Geoffrey Parker later called it the bloodiest battle of the war. And in a war that had already consumed millions through fighting, famine and plague, that is saying much. For the people of Freiburg, there was no glory. When the cannons fell silent, their vineyards were trampled, their houses plundered, their city scarred. Civilians fled into the mountains carrying what little they could. Priests recorded funerals in books that soon ran out of pages, yet strategically, the battle was indecisive. The French claimed a victory because Mercy withdrew, but they were too exhausted to pursue. The war dragged on, year after year, draining treasuries and grinding down populations. Soldiers from distant provinces fought for causes they scarcely understood, while kings and cardinals argued in gilded halls. Still, the memory of Freiburg lived on. For the French, it was proof of sacrifice and resolve, a step toward becoming the dominant power of Europe. For Bavaria, it was a bitter defense that showed they could bleed their enemies even in retreat. For the common people, it was another scar in a war that had already stolen an entire generation. In the same year that the Ming dynasty fell in China and Cromwell's Ironsides thundered across Marston Moor here in Germany, the soil itself seemed to cry out. 1644 was not just a year of endings in Asia or battles in England. It was also the year Europe's longest war reached one of its most horrific crescendos. The blood of Freiburg mingled with the Rhine and seeped into the Black Forest earth, a reminder that empires and causes are written not only in treaties and proclamations, but in the lives of those who fall nameless on the battlefield. 1644 was a year when the world seemed to unravel. In Beijing, the Chongzhen Emperor ended his life alone on a hill as the Ming dynasty collapsed. At Shanhai Pass, Wu Sangui opened the gates and allowed the Manchu banners to sweep into China, forging a new dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. Across the countryside, famine hollowed out villages, and in the night sky a comet burned, whispering that heaven itself had turned its face away. In England, Cromwell's cavalry carved a path to power at Marston Moor, reshaping the destiny of a kingdom. And in Germany, the hills of Freiburg were soaked with the blood of tens of thousands, as the 30 Years' War showed no mercy to soldier or civilian. What unites these stories is not only their violence, but their uncertainty. Each ruler, each soldier, each farmer gazed at the same year and wondered, is this the end or the beginning of something new? And here lies the twist. While dynasties fall and battles rage, history always leaves open the question of what might have been. If Wu Sangui had remained loyal, if the comet had been read as a sign of renewal rather than doom, would 1644 still be remembered as a year of collapse? Now I want to hear from you. What other stories of 1644 do you know? Share them in the comments. Let history breathe through many voices. In our next episode, we travel to a different battlefield, civil wars in England, struggles of conscience, and the rise of new ideas that challenged both sword and throne. If You enjoyed this journey? Like the video, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and if you want to keep these stories alive, consider supporting with a small donation.